Welcome everyone to this typography module. In this class, we are going to talk about the history of writing because before discussing typography, we first need to understand how writing was created. Typography, just like writing, is a human invention. In the case of typography, it became possible after the appearance of another human invention, Johannes Gutenberg's printing press in 1440. The invention of the printing press allowed for the mechanization of writing, which until then had been done by hand, individually, book by book. Therefore, in this class, we will study that entire period in history when human beings wrote their books manually, one by one. If we go back in time to the origins of written language, we will see that the first representations were pictograms. We call pictograms the signs that represent what experts have defined as sign words. For example, an ox, 2 oxen, 3 oxen, a sheep, 2 sheep, 3 sheep, or, as shown in the example here, we would have a pictogram to represent an honorable man. In other words, we would need an infinite number of pictograms to represent the world around us. The evolution of pictograms leads us to a new concept, the ideogram. This is once again a pictorial sign, but this time it represents a concept word. If before we had a drawing to represent an honorable man, now we have another drawing to represent the concept of honor. In this way, the complexity of our message increases. Finally, this evolution of written language brings us to phonograms, which are signs that no longer represent an object or a concept, but instead represent phonetic sounds. And of course, the combination of phonetic sounds allows us to form different words, which enables us to tell even more stories. Here on the right, we can see an image of a seal found in the Palace of Mari in Syria from the 17th century BCE. This seal was rolled over a clay tablet, and the engraved drawing on the seal would appear on the tablet. This was a very primitive representation system that required many seals to tell stories, so it soon evolved. We need to understand that written language follows processes of abstraction and economization. From the earliest written languages to the most recent ones, we will see how fewer and increasingly abstract symbols have been used to express more complex ideas. For example, instead of using a seal to indicate 3 oxen, we move to a pictogram, where we draw a single ox but add 3 tally marks, conveying the idea of 3 oxen. Let's now look at real historical examples, specifically Egyptian hieroglyphs. In this presentation, we will focus on the history of writing in Europe and the Near East. In other parts of the world, the development of writing followed its own unique timeline. In the case of Europe and Asia, the first civilizations to develop writing were the Egyptians and the Sumerians and Akkadians. These civilizations were closely tied to major rivers, Egypt to the Nile, and Mesopotamia to the Tigris and Euphrates. Similarly, other early civilizations also emerged near significant rivers, such as the Yellow River in China and the Rio de la Plata in the Americas. Egyptians began using hieroglyphic writing around 3200 BCE. Initially, the system had approximately 1,000 symbols, and it is said that the number never dropped below 600. Hieroglyphic writing was structured from top to bottom, and it could be read left to right or right to left. To determine the reading direction, we look at the way animals in the hieroglyphs are facing. For example, on the right, we see a fragment from the tomb of Pharaoh Seti III, 13th century BCE, where the animals face left, meaning the text should be read from right to left. The Egyptians called their writing system Medu Neter, meaning divine words, because they believed it had been given to them by the gods, specifically by Thoth, the god of writing. This is where the word hieroglyph originates, from the Greek hiero, sacred, and glyph, writing, meaning sacred writing. Hieroglyphs were not an alphabet, but rather a collection of pictorial symbols that could have multiple meanings. Egyptian pictograms could function as pictograms, ideograms, and phonograms. Additionally, Egyptians used determinatives, symbols placed at the end of words to clarify their meaning. Egyptian society was deeply religious, practicing polytheism with numerous gods linked to the natural world. Thoth, the god of writing, was also associated with magic, wisdom, and the moon. He was depicted as a man with the head of an ibis. Scribes held a high social status, as their work was considered sacred. It is said that before beginning their daily work, scribes would drop a small amount of ink in honor of Thoth. On the left, we see an image of a seated scribe, a famous statuette from the 16th century BCE housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Egyptian hieroglyphs were used for about 3,500 years, from around 3,200 BCE to 300 CE, undergoing a process of simplification and abstraction. This led to the development of hieratic writing, used for religious and administrative texts, and demotic writing, appearing around 7th century BCE, a further simplification that removed any pictorial elements. Hieroglyphs were primarily used for monumental inscriptions, such as tombs, steles, and obelisks, while hieratic and demotic writing were used for everyday purposes, written on papyrus. When Egyptian civilization declined and was eventually conquered, its writing system was lost, becoming a dead language. For over 1,600 years, no one could read hieroglyphs. In the late 18th century, during the French Revolution, Napoleon's military expedition to Egypt led to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. This stone, dating back to 196 BCE, contained a decree written in 3 scripts: 1. Hieroglyphic, 2. Demotic, and 3. Ancient Greek. In the 1820s, Jean-François Champollion successfully deciphered the hieroglyphs by recognizing the name Ptolemy V in all 3 scripts. This breakthrough allowed scholars to finally read the lost history of Egypt, including famous texts such as the Book of the Dead, the Hymn to Aten, the Instructions of Amenemop, the Tale of Sinuth. This marked one of the greatest discoveries in linguistic and historical studies, unlocking the secrets of ancient Egyptian civilization. We now turn to another form of writing that developed in parallel in the basin of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, in the area known as the Fertile Crescent. In this region, cuneiform writing emerged. The first peoples to use it were the Sumerians and the Akkadians. We will see that in many ways it shares similarities with Egyptian hieroglyphs. To begin with, the number of signs ranged between 600 and 1,000. Its reading direction was from right to left in a horizontal manner, and it was a syllabic type of writing. It is worth mentioning that the word cuneiform comes from the Latin cunus, meaning wedge. This refers to the shape of the marks made on clay tablets. Many civilizations coexisted in Mesopotamia, and several of them adopted cuneiform writing. These included the Akkadians, the Sumerians, as mentioned before, but also the Elamites, the Hittites, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Persians. Initially, around 3,500 BCE, writing was used exclusively for administrative and accounting purposes. In other words, it was used to keep track of the number of sheep one owned, the number of soldiers in the army, the quantity of amphorae needed for wine, or, as we can see in the image on the right, the number of beer rations sold that month. This particular tablet records the number of beer rations at a specific time. It was found in Uruk, a city that existed around 3,100 to 3000 BCE, in what is now Iraq. Apart from the wedge-shaped marks, the tablet also features circular indentations used for pagination. As expected, cuneiform writing underwent an evolution. It transitioned from word signs to a combination of word signs, conceptual signs, and phonograms. This allowed scribes to express more complex ideas, enabling cuneiform writing to be used for economic, religious, political, literary, and intellectual documents. In the next image, we can observe in detail the direct relationship between the tool used by Mesopotamian scribes, the stylus, which had a triangular shape, and the marks it left on the clay. This relationship is known as ductus, which can be defined as the trace left by the writing tool. It is important to note that in Mesopotamian society, only scribes were allowed to write. These scribes attended institutions called edubas or tablet houses, which functioned as schools for cuneiform writing. These schools gradually spread across Sumerian. The students, usually boys and sometimes girls from the upper classes, entered these edubas at around 8 years old and studied for 12 years. They first learned to make clear, vertical, horizontal, and oblique marks. They also had to master the size and depth of these marks. Another key skill was handling the tablet, which had to be rotated gradually as they wrote. Over time, they became capable of writing increasingly complex sentences, while also studying mathematics, accounting, history, religion, and other aspects of their culture. As mentioned earlier, cuneiform writing shares many parallels with Egyptian hieroglyphs. Like hieroglyphs, cuneiform eventually became a dead language. However, it was later deciphered thanks to a key discovery, the Behistun inscription. In this case, credit goes to Sir Henry Rawlinson, who successfully deciphered the inscription in 1837. His work was not done alone. He collaborated with other Assyriologists such as George Smith, Reverend Edward Hincks, and Jules Oppert. The crucial breakthrough came with this inscription, which recounts the achievements of King Darius I of the Achaemenid Persian Empire around the 6th century BCE. Similar to the Rosetta Stone, the inscription contained the same text written in 3 different languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, all using cuneiform script. Once again, an essential part of human history was illuminated, as scholars could finally read and understand the texts of the many civilizations that had used this writing system. It is fascinating to note that cuneiform writing was sophisticated enough to convey emotional states such as love, devotion, betrayal, fear, desire, and longing. It was the first writing system in history to tangibly express the full range of human experience, going beyond what Egyptian hieroglyphs had achieved. Some of Mesopotamia's greatest literary works, such as Atrahasis, The Descent of Inanna, The Myth of Etana, Enuma Elish, and the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, were all written in cuneiform and remained completely unknown until the mid-19th century. This discovery had profound implications, particularly for European culture, where, until the deciphering of cuneiform, it was widely believed that the Bible was the world's oldest book and many of its texts were considered original works. Stories such as the fall of man and the Great Flood were thought to be literal historical events dictated by God to the authors of Genesis. However, the discovery of these Mesopotamian texts revealed that many of these stories predated the Hebrew scriptures by centuries. For example, here on the right, we see an excerpt from the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically the 11th tablet, which describes how a god sent a flood to punish humanity. This narrative closely resembles the biblical account of Noah in Genesis. Continuing with the evolution of writing, it is important to highlight the emergence of 2 alphabets. For the first time, we are talking about an alphabet. I am referring to the Ugaritic alphabet in Syria, which appeared around 1500 BCE and was in use for about 2 centuries, and the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet in the Sinai Peninsula, which appeared a little earlier, around 1700 BCE, and also lasted for about 200 years. The Ugaritic alphabet consisted of 30 signs, meaning that the conceptual leap was enormous. We went from the 600 to 750 signs of hieroglyphs and cuneiform writing to just 30 signs in the Ugaritic alphabet. It was read from left to right and was entirely phonetic as well as consonantal, meaning there were no vowels. If we look at the image, we can clearly see how the signs are very basic simplifications of cuneiform wedges. On the other hand, the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet was not descended from cuneiform writing, as was the case with Ugaritic, but from Egyptian hieroglyphs. This alphabet had only 23 signs and could be read from right to left, from left to right, as was the case with hieroglyphs, and from top to bottom. Due to its antiquity, it is the first documented consonantal alphabet, or abjad, in history. As mentioned, it was a simplification of Egyptian hieroglyphs, and in the scarce documentation found, most instances are rock inscriptions dedicated to the goddess Hathor. a highly significant deity in the Egyptian world. These two alphabets paved the way for an even more important one, the Phoenician alphabet. This alphabet, whose 22 signs we see represented in the image on the right, was read from right to left and was a phonetic consonantal alphabet. Again, there were no vowels, and it was invented by the Phoenicians. This alphabet would change the history of writing forever. The first question we must ask is, who were the Phoenicians? The Phoenicians were an extraordinary people of merchants and navigators who settled in the land of Canaan or the Levantine coast. We see it on the map as the orange-colored area, and from there, after founding and settling in different city-states such as Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, they expanded westward across the Mediterranean, founding cities along the African coast such as Leptis, the famous Carthage, Gadia, now in Spain, and Lixus. The name Phoenician comes from the Greek word phoenix, which means purple or red. It is worth noting that the Greeks called them this because they wore garments dyed purple, a dye they produced from the secretion of a marine snail. The Phoenicians had arrived in this region, the land of Canaan, at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE, and around 1100 BCE, they invented their own alphabet, which had a significant influence from pictograms, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and conceptually from the Ugaritic and Proto-Semitic alphabets. As mentioned, this alphabet would exert an incredible influence on the development of various alphabets across different languages. For example, the names of the first 3 characters of this alphabet, shown in the first column starting from the left, are called Aleph, Bet, and Gimel in Phoenician. These names should sound familiar as they correspond to Alpha, Beta, and Gamma in the Greek alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet was of extraordinary importance. From it, if we move westward, the Greek alphabet would develop, which in turn gave rise to the Cyrillic, Etruscan, and finally, the Latin alphabet. Similarly, if we move eastward, the Aramaic alphabet emerged from the Phoenician alphabet, leading to the Hebrew alphabet and the Nabatean alphabet, which later evolved into the Arabic alphabet. If this topic fascinates you and piques your curiosity, I recommend examining this table to see how the different pictograms and signs evolved from Egyptian hieroglyphs to Proto-Sinaitic, leading to the Phoenician alphabet, and how from there these phonetic and entirely abstract characters transitioned to archaic Greek, then Greek, and finally Latin. It is truly fascinating to observe how an Egyptian pictogram representing what are probably sea waves eventually became our Latin letter M, or how a snake turned into our N, or how the famous Eye of Horus became our O. In this image, we can see the longest inscription in Phoenician language found to date. This is the sarcophagus of King Ahiram, Phoenician king of Byblos, around 1000 BCE. I leave you the transcript for whoever is interested in reading it. Remember to read it from right to left and that it is an alphabet without vowels. As we saw, moving westward from the Phoenician alphabet led to the Greek alphabet. It is unclear whether the Greeks traveled to the Levantine coast or if the Phoenicians reached the Greek coast, but in any case, there was commercial exchange that resulted in the Greeks, who at the time wrote using a syllabary known as Linear B, discovering the Phoenician alphabet. They realized it was far superior, adopted it, and adapted it to their own language. The Greek alphabet consisted of 24 signs instead of 22, as they added 2 additional characters along with vowels. For the first time, it was not a consonantal alphabet, but a vocalic one. This was a significant change, as it allowed anyone to read it. Consonantal alphabets function in such a way that a reader must be very familiar with the language, almost natively, to understand it. For example, in Phoenician, since vowels were not represented, the reader had to infer them based on the position of consonants, context, etc. With the Greek vocalic alphabet, these ambiguities disappeared, making it a much simpler system for anyone to learn and use. What did this mean? It meant a democratization of knowledge and the literacy of society. Until then, writing had been reserved for a very high social class: scribes, scholars, and the wealthy. From this point on, practically anyone in Greek society could read and write. Needless to say, this was one of the key factors in the development of Greek civilization and a crucial element in the emergence of its famous democracy. The Greek alphabet, which emerged around 800 BCE, remains in use today. We must remember that it began in an archaic form. The characters were all uppercase, and the strokes, as seen in the image on the right, were still quite crude, very polygonal and geometric. In fact, the image on the right shows the so-called Laws of Gortin, written in archaic Greek around the 5th century BCE. Gortin was a city in Crete, and these laws determined the rights of citizens, slaves, and foreigners. It is the oldest and most extensive known Greek legal text. Interestingly, it is written in a style called boustrophodon. That is, it is read in the way an ox plows a field, starting from left to right, then turning at the end of the line and reading the next line from right to left. If you look at the image, you can see how the S characters change direction, as do the P, K, etc. It is fascinating to think that this archaic Greek writing method, though not the boustrophodon style, which was more specific to the laws of Gortin, was used by all the well-known Greek figures of the classical world, such as Aristotle, the tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, Socrates, Diogenes, and many others. Thus, if we continue advancing through the history of the Greek people and the development of their alphabet, we could highlight the famous Library of Alexandria. This library was founded in the city of Alexandria, in the Nile Delta, in the 3rd century BCE. The city itself was established by the general Alexander the Great. It is important to briefly discuss the history of this figure, as it was Alexander, a Macedonian king, who first united the different Greek city-states and then moved into the Asian continent, where he conquered the Achaemenid Persian Empire. At that time, this Achaemenid Persian Empire ruled over Egypt. When Alexander entered and conquered Egypt, he founded the first and most important of his many Alexandrias. This marked the beginning of the so-called Hellenistic world, where Greek culture expanded and spread across nearly the entire known world. Many historians refer to this period as the first globalization, in which Greek and its alphabet became the lingua franca of the entire Mediterranean. In a way, it is similar to what happens with English today. In this context, the Library of Alexandria became the most important center of knowledge in the world. The Lagged kings, descendants of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's generals, pursued an enlightened policy in which they acquired books from all over the world and had them copied into Greek. These books were brought by ships known as book ships and stored in the Great Library. As a result, the greatest scholars and intellectuals of the time passed through Alexandria. One of them was Dionysius Thrax, who lived between 170 and 90 BCE. And wrote a book called Technigrammatic, The Art of Grammar, which holds special significance as it is considered the first Greek grammar in contemporary terms. This way he created a grammatical corpus for Greek. He introduced lowercase letters, word separation, accent marks, and breathings. Up until then, all Greek texts had been written in archaic Greek. Additionally, from the 3rd century BCE onward, a new writing medium began to be used in the Mediterranean, alongside papyrus, parchment. Its name comes from the Greek colony of Pergamon in Asia Minor, where it was invented. Unlike papyrus, parchment was made from animal skin, mainly sheep, which was stretched until it reached the dermis, making it more durable and easier to obtain. It also allowed writing on both sides. In the image to the right, we can already see the Greek alphabet in both its uppercase and lowercase variants. The Library of Alexandria met a tragic end, as it was gradually destroyed over time due to fires, earthquakes, and other disasters. Its final chapter occurred in the late 4th century CE, when the Museion was destroyed by Christian Parabolani. To understand the magnitude of the loss caused by the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, Carl Sagan described it as a lobotomy in the history of humanity. Here's an example. Out of 127 theatrical works by Sophocles, only 7 have survived. However, as we mentioned earlier, advancements in Greek grammar were highly significant. Here we can see how that lowercase Greek script would look, with a representation of the first verses of Homer's Iliad, written around the 8th century BCE. Moving forward, as we previously mentioned, from the Greek alphabet, we transitioned to the Latin alphabet. This alphabet emerged in southern Italy around 700 BCE, and as we know, it is still in use today. In fact, it is the most widely used alphabet in the world, followed by the Arabic alphabet. Initially, it consisted of 21 characters, was read from left to right, and was a vocalic alphabet like Greek. The Greeks, in addition to expanding eastward and founding colonies, also moved westward, settling in what is known as Magna Graecia in cities such as Palermo and Syracuse. Through this expansion, the Greeks came into contact with the inhabitants of the Italian peninsula. At that time, the most significant people in the region were the Etruscans, who quickly adopted the Greek alphabet. Later, as the Romans grew more powerful, they came into contact with the Etruscans and adapted the alphabet to their own language, creating the Latin alphabet. As we know, the Romans expanded throughout the world as the new dominant power, and they were above all a practical people. They preserved the Greek alphabet almost unchanged, but redesigned the characters to make them more legible, using purer geometries and emphasizing proportion and symmetry, principles of beauty, strength, and utility that they also applied in architecture and engineering, such as in their aqueducts, roads, baths, and temples. The Latin alphabet, or abecedarium, as the Romans called it, is used in many languages, including Albanian, German, Afrikaans, Filipino Tagalog, Malay, and Indonesian. Meanwhile, the Latin language, spoken by the Romans, evolved into various Romance languages, such as Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. It is worth noting that the Latin alphabet had different styles as seen in the image. One type of script was called Capitalis Quadrata or Capitalis Quadrata Lapidaria, mainly used for inscriptions on monuments and of great institutional importance. Then there was Capitalis Rustica, used for more secondary writings, and finally Roman cursive, which had a much more informal character. However, Roman writing relied solely on uppercase letters. In the next image on the right, we see a detail from Trajan's column inscribed in Capitalis Quadrata or Capitalis Quadrata Lapidaria, a type of writing that Adobe has recreated in a nearly identical typeface called Trajan Pro. The image on the left demonstrates how this type of script follows a particular ductus. Remember when we talked about the ductus of cuneiform writing related to the stylus used to make marks? In this case, the ductus is defined by the brush. The brush allowed for more fluid shapes, increasing or decreasing contrast in typography, and was likely used as a guide before the letters were carved into the marble. Here we can see a video of Oriol Miró, a calligrapher from Barcelona, demonstrating how he uses this tool to create Roman Capitalis Quadrata Lapidaria script. We are approaching the end of our journey. Leaving the Roman Empire, we arrive at the Middle Ages. A significant transformation in writing occurred during the reign of Charlemagne. with the creation of what became known as Carolingian minuscule. This was a brief empire that sought to unify various European states during the Middle Ages. It emerged in 800 CE when Charlemagne was crowned emperor in Rome by Pope Leo III, symbolizing the restoration of the Western Roman Empire. The goal was to establish a new political and religious order, and to achieve this, Charlemagne believed that a standardized writing system was necessary. Thus, a formalization of writing rules took place, establishing clear and disciplined norms. To the right, we can see a page from the so-called phrasing manuscripts written in the 9th century CE. This page is written in Slovenian using the Latin alphabet and in Carolingian minuscule. We can observe that Carolingian minuscule is very clear and uniform, with more rounded shapes, high legibility, distinct lowercase and uppercase letters, well-defined word spacing, and prominent ascenders and descenders, which make the letters appear smaller and enhance readability. However, the Carolingian Empire lasted only about a century, and writing continued to evolve into more condensed and angular forms, especially in Northern Europe in countries like Germany and England. An example is textura quadrata, where spacing between letters, words, and lines was reduced, making texts appear darker and denser. In contrast, Southern European countries like Italy and Spain developed rotunda script, which was more rounded and legible. By the 14th century, the Renaissance had begun in Italy, seeking to revive the values of ancient Greece and Rome. The concept of humanism emerged, emphasizing humans rather than God as the center of thought. This led to new artistic, architectural, and typographic values, including the humanistic script. Here on the right, we have an image with an example of humanist writing where the text and words have a certain degree of irregularity characteristic of the human hand. It is also defined by a slight contrast between thick and thin strokes. The bar of the letter E always appears inclined, and the serifs tend to be thick, short, and oblique on the ascenders. Here are some modern typefaces that mimic this humanist writing style: Bimbo, Jensen, Berkeley, Destyle, Gensans, Mediat, OpenSans, Verdana, and Optimize. Moving a little further forward, we come to the key invention that changed everything: the printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany in 1440. We are almost in the middle of the 15th century, and this is a pivotal moment in human history. Many important events take place, and the invention of the printing press is one of the most significant. This marks the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern age. It is important to remember that in the mid-15th century, the 100 Years' War between England and France came to an end. The Byzantine Empire fell with the conquest of Byzantium, marking the end of the Eastern Roman Empire after approximately 1,000 years. Around this time, the theories of Galileo and Copernicus emerged, placing the Earth as a planet orbiting the Sun. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci would soon make their mark, contributing to anatomy, art, architecture, perspective, medicine, and botany. Europe would come into contact with the American continent through Christopher Columbus in 1492, and the first circumnavigation of the world would be completed by Ferdinand Magellan and Juan Sebastián Elcano. In short, the world was about to change dramatically, and in this context the printing press emerged. Thanks to the printing press, printing methods were mechanized, leading to the mass production of books. We can only imagine the revolution this created, as it allowed people anywhere in the world to have a copy of any book and read it. This resulted in an incredible flow of knowledge and exchange of ideas. It was then, and only then, that the concept of typography emerged. Until this point we had been talking about writing, but from now on we must talk about typography. With the printing press, the age of handwriting that had lasted for approximately 5,000 years, since 3500 BC, with cuneiform writing, came to an end. A new era had begun, and we will explore it in the following lessons. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. It's time to say goodbye, and I hope to see you in the next classes.